The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of downtown Washington, D.C., as Kyla stepped off the metro train. At just 18 years old, she looked like any other college student heading to class. Her worn sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished station floor, and her backpack hung loosely over one shoulder. She pulled her hood up against the cool October breeze as she made her way toward the surface. But Kyla was far from ordinary. While most kids her age were struggling through their first year of college, she had already graduated from one of the most prestigious universities in the country 2 years ago. Her mind worked differently than others. Numbers, patterns, and complex problems that would stump most adults seemed to solve themselves in her head almost instantly. She walked with purpose through the crowded sidewalks, dodging office workers rushing to their morning meetings. The city always amazed her with its energy. People moved like they had somewhere important to be, which in this town they usually did. Government buildings stretched toward the sky around her, each one holding secrets and decisions that shaped the world. Kyla checked her phone for the third time in 10 minutes. The message was still there, marked urgent and classified. Her supervisor needed specific equipment for an operation that could not wait. The kind of equipment that regular stores did not carry, but she knew exactly where to find it. Tech World Electronics sat on the corner of a busy intersection, its large windows displaying the latest gadgets and devices. From the outside, it looked like any other electronics store, but Kyla knew better. This place specialized in equipment that went far beyond what normal customers needed. Security systems, surveillance gear, and communication devices that could change the course of important missions. She paused outside the store, watching the people inside through the glass windows. Business people in expensive suits examined laptops and tablets. A security guard stood near the entrance, his eyes scanning everyone who walked through the doors. The place had the quiet, serious atmosphere of somewhere that dealt with important clients and sensitive equipment. Taking a deep breath, Kyla pushed open the heavy glass door. A soft chime announced her arrival, and she felt several pairs of eyes turn toward her. The store was larger inside than it appeared from the street. Rows of gleaming devices lined the walls, each one more sophisticated than the last. Price tags showed numbers that would make most people gasp. She walked slowly through the aisles, her trained eye scanning the equipment. Her supervisor had been very specific about what they needed. High-frequency radio transmitters, encrypted communication devices, and surveillance equipment that could operate in harsh conditions. The kind of gear that could mean the difference between success and failure in the field. A sales associate watched her from behind the counter. He was probably in his 40s, with perfectly combed hair and a suit that looked more expensive than most people's cars. His eyes followed her movements with barely hidden suspicion. Kyla was used to this reaction. People often assumed she did not belong in places like this. She stopped in front of a display case filled with communication equipment. The devices looked innocent enough, but she knew their true capabilities. These were not toys or gadgets for tech enthusiasts. This was serious equipment used by people who needed to stay connected when lives were on the line. "Can I help you find something?" The sales associate had appeared beside her, his voice polite but cautious. "I am looking at your professional communication systems," Kyla replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. "Specifically anything with military-grade encryption capabilities." The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Those are very specialized items. What kind of application are you considering?" Kyla had rehearsed this conversation in her mind. She could not reveal the true nature of her work, but she needed to sound legitimate. "Research project. We need secure communication for field work in remote locations." The explanation seemed to satisfy him, at least partially. He unlocked the display case and began showing her different models, explaining their features in technical detail. Kyla nodded and asked intelligent questions, demonstrating knowledge that surprised him. As they talked, she noticed other employees gathering nearby. Their conversations were too quiet to hear, but their glances in her direction were obvious. A woman behind the main counter kept looking up from her computer screen to stare. Two men near the camera display were whispering while pointing subtly in her direction. Kyla tried to ignore the attention and focus on the equipment. She pulled out her phone to check the specifications her supervisor had sent. The device she Needed was here, along with several backup options. This trip would be successful despite the uncomfortable stares from the staff. I will need to see the technical specifications for this model, she said, pointing to a sophisticated radio system. And I would like to compare it with your next tier up. The sales associate hesitated. These are quite expensive items. Perhaps I should get our manager. Before she could respond, he had already walked away toward the back office. Kyla sighed, quietly. This was becoming more complicated than it needed to be. She just wanted to buy the equipment and return to headquarters before lunch. While she waited, she examined other items in the display. Night vision scopes, electronic countermeasure devices, and GPS systems that could work anywhere in the world. Each piece represented years of research and development, technology that could give someone a significant advantage in the right situation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor asking for an update. Kyla typed back quickly, explaining that she had found the equipment but was dealing with some delays. She did not mention the suspicious looks or the whispered conversations happening around her. The store manager appeared a few minutes later, a thin man with nervous energy and constantly moving hands. He approached her with a forced smile that did not reach his eyes. I understand you are interested in some of our professional equipment, he said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he doubted her legitimacy. That is correct, Kyla replied, calmly. I need to purchase several items for a research project. The manager looked her up and down, taking in her casual clothes and young appearance. These are very expensive items. Do you have authorization from your institution? The question stung even though Kyla had expected it. People always questioned her authority, her qualifications, her right to be in certain places. She had learned to handle it professionally, but it never stopped being frustrating. I have all necessary authorization, she said firmly. Would you like to see my identification? Before the manager could respond, she noticed the security guard moving closer. Other customers had begun to stare openly now, sensing some kind of tension in the air. The atmosphere in the store had shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed suspicion. Kyla realized this simple equipment purchase was about to become much more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The manager's smile faded completely as he studied Kyla more carefully. His eyes moved from her sneakers to her hoodie, then to the backpack slung over her shoulder. Everything about his expression suggested he had already made up his mind about her. You know what? Let me just verify a few things first, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. We have had some issues lately with people coming in here asking about expensive equipment they cannot afford. Kyla felt heat rise in her cheeks. The implication was clear, and it had nothing to do with her age or her clothes. She had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself to stay professional. I understand your need to be careful, she replied evenly, but I am a legitimate customer with a real need for this equipment. Perhaps we could move forward with the purchase? The manager stepped back and crossed his arms. Actually, I think we should take a break here. You have been looking at very specific items, asking detailed questions about capabilities and taking notes on your phone. That raises some red flags for us. Around them, other customers began to take notice of the conversation. A businessman in an expensive suit stopped examining tablets to listen. Two women near the smartphone display turned to watch. The security guard moved even closer, his hand resting casually near his radio. Kyla realized the situation was escalating, beyond a simple misunderstanding. I am taking notes because I need to report back to my supervisor about the specifications. This is standard procedure for any professional purchase. Right, the manager said, his tone dripping with disbelief. And what kind of research project needs military-grade communication equipment exactly? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kyla knew she was walking a fine line. She could not reveal the classified nature of her work, but she needed to provide enough information to seem legitimate. Unfortunately, the manager seemed determined to believe the worst about her intentions. Environmental research in remote locations, she said, sticking to her cover story. We need reliable communication systems that can operate in harsh conditions without being intercepted. The manager exchanged a look with the sales associate who had first helped her. Some kind of silent communication passed between them, and Kyla did not like what she saw in their expressions. Environmental research, the manager repeated slowly. And you are how old exactly? My age is not relevant to this purchase, Kyla said firmly. I am an adult with valid identification and the means to pay for what I need. But the manager was already shaking his head. Look, I run a legitimate business here. We sell to government contractors, security firms, and established research institutions. We do not sell high-end surveillance equipment to teenagers who walk in off the street with vague stories about environmental research. The words hit Kyla like a slap. She could feel every eye in the store focused on their conversation now. The businessman had pulled out his phone and seemed to be recording. The women near the smartphone display were whispering to each other while staring directly at her. I think there has been a misunderstanding, Kyla said, working hard to keep her voice calm. I am not just some teenager. I am a qualified professional making a legitimate purchase for my organization. What organization? The manager demanded. Give me a name and a phone number I can call to verify. This was the trap Kyla had hoped to avoid. She could not give them real contact information for the CIA without blowing her cover. But without it, she looked exactly like what they thought she was, a young person with no legitimate reason to be there. I cannot provide that information without proper clearance procedures, she said carefully. The manager's face lit up with vindication. Right. Of course you cannot. Because there is no organization, is there? You are probably some kid trying to impress your friends, or maybe planning something you should not be planning. That is absolutely not true, Kyla protested, but she could hear how weak it sounded. The security guard stepped forward now, his presence adding weight to the manager's accusations. Maybe we should call the police, he suggested. Let them sort this out. Fear shot through Kyla's chest. Getting the police involved would create exactly the kind of attention her mission was supposed to avoid. But she could see the situation spinning completely out of control. There is no need for police, she said quickly. I am just trying to make a purchase. If you do not want my business, I can go somewhere else. Actually, the manager said, his voice taking on a hard edge, I think you have been in here long enough, taking pictures, asking detailed questions about surveillance equipment, making notes about our security systems. That sounds like someone planning a robbery to me. The accusation was so ridiculous that Kyla almost laughed. Almost. But the serious expressions around her made it clear that nobody else found it funny. The security guard was already reaching for his radio. I have not taken any pictures, Kyla said firmly. I have only been taking notes about product specifications which any customer would do before making a major purchase. Show me your phone then, the manager demanded. If you have nothing to hide, let us see what kind of notes you have been taking. Kyla's phone contained classified information she could never show to civilians. Messages from her supervisor, operational details and contacts that could compromise national security. But refusing to show it would only make her look more suspicious. I cannot show you my phone without proper authorization, she said. It contains confidential information related to my work. The manager turned to the security guard with a knowing look. Confidential information, right. Call the police. Tell them we have someone suspicious casing the store. Wait, Kyla said desperately. You are making a huge mistake. I am exactly who I say I am. But the security guard was already speaking into his radio. We need a unit at Tech World Electronics on 5th Street. We have a suspicious individual who may be planning criminal activity. Around them, customers began pulling out phones to record what was happening. Kyla could see herself becoming the center of a social media storm before this was over. The businessman who had been recording earlier was now live streaming on what looked like Instagram. This is ridiculous, Kyla said, her professional composure finally starting to crack. I am a customer trying to make a purchase. I have done nothing wrong. People who have done nothing wrong do not get defensive when asked simple questions, the manager replied smugly. and they do not refuse to show identification or provide references. I offered to show you identification, Kyla reminded him. You were the one who wanted to verify other things first. But her words were lost in the growing commotion. More customers had gathered to watch the drama unfold. Someone near the back of the store was narrating the scene for their social media followers. The security guard was describing Kyla to the police dispatcher, using words like suspicious behavior and potential theft. Kyla realized she was trapped. She could not reveal her true identity without compromising her mission, but refusing to do so made her look guilty of exactly what they were accusing her of. Every option seemed to lead to the same place: a confrontation with police officers who would have no more reason to believe her story than the store manager did. She looked around the store at all the faces staring at her. Some looked curious, others judgmental, and a few seemed almost excited by the drama. Not one person seemed to consider that maybe, just maybe, they were witnessing something other than what it appeared to be. The manager was speaking to the security guard now, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I want her searched when they get here. I bet she has stolen merchandise in that backpack. Kyla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In a few minutes, police officers would arrive expecting to find a criminal. Instead, they would find a young black woman with a story nobody was prepared to believe. She could already imagine how that conversation would go. Her phone buzzed with another message from her supervisor. The mission timeline was tight and delays were not acceptable. But explaining to her boss that a simple equipment purchase had turned into a public incident would be almost as difficult as dealing with the police. The sound of sirens was already growing closer outside. The patrol car pulled up outside Tech World Electronics with its lights flashing but no siren. Through the large windows, Kyla could see two officers getting out of the vehicle. One was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of someone used to taking control of situations. The other was shorter, but carried himself with the same air of authority. Inside the store, the manager straightened his tie and walked toward the entrance to greet them. The security guard joined him, and Kyla found herself standing alone in the center of what felt like a growing circle of spectators. Customers had stopped pretending to shop and were openly watching the drama unfold. The tall officer entered first, his eyes immediately scanning the store before settling on Kyla. She could see him taking in her appearance. Young, black, dressed casually in a space filled with expensive equipment and well-dressed customers. His partner followed close behind, already reaching for the small notebook he kept in his chest pocket. Officers Rodriguez and Chen, the tall one announced to the manager. We got a call about suspicious activity? The manager nodded eagerly, gesturing toward Kyla. That young woman there has been acting very strange. She came in asking detailed questions about surveillance equipment, taking notes on her phone, and refusing to provide proper identification or references for her so-called research project. Officer Rodriguez walked slowly toward Kyla, his eyes never leaving her face. What is your name, miss? Kyla Washington, she replied, working to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. And what brings you to this store today, Kyla? She took a deep breath. I need to purchase communication equipment for a research project. I was looking at radio systems and asking normal customer questions about their capabilities. Officer Chen had joined his partner now, forming what felt like an intimidating wall of authority in front of her. The manager says you were asking about military-grade equipment. That seems unusual for a research project. We work in remote locations where standard communication systems are not reliable, Kyla explained, sticking to her cover story. We need something that can operate effectively in harsh conditions. What kind of research? Rodriguez asked, his tone suggesting he did not believe her any more than the manager had. Environmental monitoring, Kyla said. We study climate effects in isolated areas. The officers exchanged a look that Kyla did not like. Chen flipped open his notebook and began writing. And what organization do you work for? This was the question Kyla had been dreading. I cannot provide specific details about my employer. Without proper clearance procedures. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. You cannot tell us who you work for? It is not that simple, Kyla said carefully. There are protocols I have to follow. Right, Chen said, his pen moving across the paper. "So you cannot tell us who you work for, you cannot provide references, and you were asking detailed questions about surveillance equipment. That does sound suspicious." Around them, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Someone near the back was live-streaming the entire interaction, providing commentary for their online audience. "This is crazy," the person was saying. "They have got this girl surrounded like she robbed a bank or something." The manager stepped forward again, clearly enjoying the validation of having the police take his concerns seriously. "She also refused to show me what she had been writing on her phone, claims it contains confidential information." "Is that true?" Rodriguez asked Kyla. "You refuse to show your phone?" "My phone contains sensitive work-related information," Kyla said firmly. "I cannot share it without proper authorization." "Convenient," Chen muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Rodriguez moved closer, invading Kyla's personal space in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. "Here's the thing, Kyla. We have got a store manager who says you were acting suspiciously, asking strange questions, and refusing to cooperate with reasonable requests. Now you are telling us you cannot provide basic information about who you work for or what you were doing. That adds up to a problem." "I have not done anything wrong," Kyla said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. "I came here to buy equipment. I answered questions about what I needed. I offered to show identification. The only thing I cannot do is compromise confidential information." "What kind of confidential information does an environmental researcher have?" Chen asked skeptically. The question hung in the air like a trap. Kyla realized that every answer she gave only made her sound more suspicious to people who had already decided she was lying. But she could not reveal the truth without creating an even bigger problem. "Research data, contact information for team, members, location details for our field sites," she said, hoping it sounded plausible. "Standard confidentiality agreements apply to all of our work." Rodriguez was shaking his head before she finished speaking. "That does not make sense. Environmental research is not classified information. You should be able to tell us who you work for and what you are really doing here." "Unless she is not really an environmental researcher," Chen added helpfully. The manager jumped on this opening. "Exactly what I was thinking. I bet she is planning to rob the place. She was asking very specific questions about our security systems and taking detailed notes about our most expensive equipment." "I was asking about the equipment because I need to purchase it," Kyla protested. "Any customer would ask questions before spending thousands of dollars on technical equipment." "Thousands of dollars?" Rodriguez repeated. "You have thousands of dollars to spend on surveillance equipment?" "My organization provided funding for necessary equipment purchases," Kyler explained. "The organization you cannot name," Chen said with obvious sarcasm. Kyla felt the situation spiraling completely out of control. Every word she spoke seemed to make things worse. The officers had clearly decided she was lying about something, and her inability to provide specific details about her work only reinforced their suspicions. "Look," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone police officers used when they had made up their minds. "We are going to need you to empty your pockets and let us search your backpack. If you are really just a customer, you should not have any problem with that." "I do have a problem with that," Kyla said firmly. "You have no legal basis to search me. I have not committed any crime." "Refusing a reasonable request during a suspicious person's investigation," Chen said, making another note. "That is not helping your case." The crowd around them was getting larger and more vocal. Someone shouted, "Just let them search you if you have nothing to hide." Another voice called out, "This is harassment." The live streamer was providing running commentary about police procedures and civil rights. Rodriguez held up his hand for quiet. "Everyone needs to step back and let us handle this." He turned back to Kyla. "You can cooperate voluntarily, or we can detain you while we sort this out. Your choice." Kyla realized she was facing an impossible decision. Cooperating meant revealing classified materials that could compromise national security. Refusing meant escalating the situation even further, and potentially being arrested on bogus charges. Her phone buzzed again with what she knew was another urgent message from her supervisor. The mission timeline was slipping away while she stood, trapped in this ridiculous situation. Soon, someone would start asking questions about why a CIA operative was involved in a public incident at an electronics store. "I need to make a phone call," she said desperately. "I can have someone explain the situation and clear this up." "Who are you going to call?" Rodriguez asked suspiciously. Kyla hesitated. Calling her supervisor would expose the operation, but it might be the only way to prevent the situation from getting even worse. "My supervisor, he can verify who I am and why I am here." Chen looked at his partner and shrugged. "She can make one call, but we are not going anywhere until we get some real answers." As Kyla reached for her phone, she realized she was about to make a decision that would change everything. The simple equipment purchase had become a public spectacle, and now she was going to have to reveal information that was supposed to stay secret. The manager was smiling smugly, clearly convinced. He had been right all along. The officers were watching her every move, ready to pounce on any sign of deception. The crowd was recording everything, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved forever on social media. Kyla took a deep breath and prepared to make the call that would expose her true identity to a room full of strangers. Kyla stared at her phone for a long moment, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. Around her, the crowd had grown restless. The live streamer was narrating every detail to thousands of online viewers. The officers stood with their arms crossed, clearly expecting her call to be just another desperate attempt to avoid consequences. "Make it quick," Officer Rodriguez said impatiently. "We do not have all day." But instead of dialing, Kyla made a different choice. She reached slowly into her back pocket, her movements careful and deliberate to avoid startling the officers. What she pulled out was not her phone, but a small leather wallet that looked ordinary from the outside. "Actually," she said quietly, "I think there is something you need to see first." She opened the wallet and held it up for the officers to examine. Inside was an identification card unlike anything most people had ever seen. The official seal, the specialized formatting, and the unmistakable letters CIA printed across the top made the document impossible to mistake for anything else. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Officer Rodriguez's confident expression melted into confusion, then shock. His partner Chen nearly dropped his notebook. The manager's smug smile disappeared so quickly it was as if someone had erased it from his face. "Central Intelligence Agency," Kyla said calmly, her voice carrying a new authority that had not been there before. "Intelligence analyst level, 7 clearance. I am here on official government business." The store fell completely silent. Even the live streamer stopped talking, apparently too stunned to provide commentary. Customers who had been recording with their phones slowly lowered their devices, unsure whether they were witnessing something they should not be seeing. Officer Rodriguez took the identification with hands that trembled slightly. He examined it closely, checking the official seals, the embedded security features, and the photograph that clearly matched the young woman standing in front of him. His partner leaned in to look over his shoulder, his face growing pale as the reality of the situation sank in. This is real," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is very real," Kyla confirmed. "And you have just compromised a classified federal operation by creating this public spectacle." The manager stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. But you are just a kid. You cannot be CIA. That is impossible." Kyla turned to face him, and her entire demeanor had transformed. Gone was the defensive teenager trying to explain herself. In her place stood a federal agent who was clearly not happy about having her cover blown in front of dozens of witnesses. "Age is not a requirement for intelligence work," she said coldly. "Intelligence, training, and security clearance are, all of which I possess, and all of which should have been irrelevant to a simple equipment purchase." Officer Chen had found his voice again, though it sounded strained. We had no way of knowing. You could have identified yourself earlier." "I could not identify myself earlier because I was working undercover," Kyla explained with forced patience. "The entire point of covert operations is that they remain covert. Your assumption that I was a criminal based on my age and appearance has now compromised national security." The implications of what she was saying began to sink in around the room. Customers exchanged nervous glances. The person who had been live streaming looked terrified, apparently realizing they might have broadcast classified information to thousands of people. Officer Rodriguez handed the identification back to Kyla with shaking hands. What do we do now? Now you let me complete my mission, Kyla said firmly. I need to purchase specific equipment for an operation that cannot be delayed any further. She turned back to the sales associate who had first helped her, the man who had seemed suspicious of her from the moment she walked in. He was staring at her with wide eyes, clearly struggling to reconcile the young woman in casual clothes with the federal agent she had revealed herself to be. I believe we were discussing communication systems, she said to him. I need the devices I specified and I need them packaged for immediate transport. The man nodded frantically, scrambling to unlock display cases and gather the equipment she had requested. His hands shook as he worked, nearly dropping several expensive items in his haste to comply. The manager approached cautiously, his earlier hostility replaced by obvious fear. Agent Washington, I need to apologize. We had no idea who you were. We were just trying to protect our store. Kyla looked at him with an expression that could freeze water. You were not protecting anything. You made assumptions about me based on what I looked like, not on what I was doing. A real criminal would have left the moment you started acting suspicious. A real threat would not have offered identification or tried to explain their legitimate business. But the equipment you were asking about, the manager stammered, is exactly the kind of equipment my agency uses to protect national security, Kyla finished. Equipment that we purchase from legitimate vendors like this store when we are not being harassed by staff who think they can determine someone's legitimacy based on their skin color and age. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. No one in the store could deny what they had all witnessed. A young black woman had been treated as a criminal suspect for doing nothing more than trying to make a purchase. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously. What do we need to do about the public nature of this incident? Kyla looked around at all the phones that had been recording, at the live streamer who was still broadcasting to an online audience, at the crowd of people who would undoubtedly be posting about this on social media within minutes. The damage is already done, she said with obvious frustration. My cover is blown. The operation will need to be restructured, and I will be spending the rest of the day doing damage control, instead of completing my mission. The sales associate had finished gathering her equipment and was carefully packing it into secure cases. His movements were quick and efficient now, driven by what appeared to be genuine remorse for his earlier behavior. There is no charge for this equipment, the manager said quickly. Consider it our apology for the misunderstanding. Kyla shook her head. There was no misunderstanding. You saw a young black woman asking about expensive equipment and assumed she was a criminal. That was not a mistake, it was prejudice. And I will be paying for this equipment because my agency does not accept charity, especially from people who profile federal agents. She pulled out a government credit card and handed it to the sales associate. The transaction went through quickly, with none of the verification procedures that had been demanded earlier. As the receipt printed, Kyla turned to address the entire store. I want everyone here to think about what just happened. You saw someone who did not fit your expectations of what a customer should look like, and you immediately assumed the worst. That assumption led to a public incident that compromised a federal operation. She picked up the cases containing her equipment, checking to make sure everything was secure. The next time you see someone who does not look like what you expect, maybe ask yourself whether your assumptions are based on facts or on prejudice. The officers stood awkwardly nearby, clearly unsure whether they should apologize, leave, or ask more questions. The manager looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Customers throughout the store were staring at the floor, apparently embarrassed by what they had witnessed. Kyla walked toward the exit, her mission equipment in hand, but her cover completely blown. As she reached the door, she turned back one final time. For what it's worth, she said, her voice carrying a note of sadness beneath the authority. I was actually looking forward to shopping here again in the future. You have excellent equipment and knowledgeable staff. It is unfortunate that your customer service policies are not as impressive as your inventory." The automatic doors slid open, and she walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving behind a store full of people who would never forget the day they learned that appearances could be very deceiving indeed. The autumn air felt cool against Kyla's face as she stepped outside Tech World Electronics, carrying her equipment cases toward the waiting taxi. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sounds of intense conversation through the store's windows. People were still processing what they had just witnessed, and she knew the ripple effects would continue long after she was gone. Her phone rang as she loaded the cases into the trunk. The caller ID showed her supervisor's direct line, and she knew this conversation would not be pleasant. "Agent Washington." Director Hassan's voice was crisp and controlled, but she could hear the underlying concern. "I just received a very interesting call from our media monitoring team. Something about a federal agent being identified in a public incident." Kyla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Sir, the equipment procurement mission encountered unexpected complications. My cover was compromised when local police responded to a suspicious person call." "Explain." As the taxi pulled away from the store, Kyla gave her supervisor a detailed account of everything that had happened. She described the manager's initial suspicion, the escalating accusations, the arrival of the police, and the final decision to reveal her identity. Hassan listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. "So let me understand this correctly," he said when she finished. "You were treated as a criminal suspect for attempting to make a legitimate purchase, and the situation escalated to the point where revealing your identity was the only way to prevent arrest?" "That is correct, sir. I tried every possible way to complete the mission without compromising operational security, but the assumptions being made about me left no viable alternatives." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Agent Washington, I want you to know that this incident reflects no fault on your part. You handled an impossible situation as professionally as anyone could have. The fault lies entirely with the individuals who allowed their prejudices to interfere with routine business." The validation from her supervisor meant more than Kyla had expected. She had been worried that her blown cover would be seen as a failure, even though the circumstances had been completely beyond her control. "What are the implications for the operation, sir?" "We will adapt. We always do. The equipment you secured is exactly what we needed, and we will find alternative approaches for the remaining phases of the mission. Your safety and well-being are more important than maintaining cover." As the taxi moved through downtown traffic, Kyla watched the city pass by her window. Office workers walked along the sidewalks, going about their daily routines with no idea that they shared their community. With federal agents working to protect national security, most of them would never know how many young people, how many women, how many people of color served their country in ways that required them to blend invisibly into everyday life. "There is something else we need to discuss," Hassan continued. "The public nature of this incident means we will likely face media attention. Our press office is already working on a response, but I want to know how you feel about potentially speaking to reporters." Kyla considered the question carefully. What kind of message would we want to convey? The truth. That intelligence work is performed by Americans of all backgrounds. That age and appearance do not determine someone's capabilities or legitimacy, and that assumptions based on prejudice can have serious consequences. The idea of speaking publicly about what had happened both excited and terrified Kyla. On one hand, it could help other young people see that they too could serve their country in meaningful ways. On the other hand, it would mean permanent exposure, an end to the anonymity that had allowed her to work undercover. "I would be willing to do that, sir, if you think it would serve a positive purpose." "I do. But think it over carefully. Once you speak publicly about this, your undercover career will be essentially over. You would transition to different types of work within the agency." After ending the call, Kyla asked the taxi driver to take her to a small park near CIA headquarters where she often went to think. She sat on a bench overlooking a pond, watching ducks swim in lazy circles while she processed everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications. The live stream from the store had been shared thousands of times. News outlets were picking up the story. Social media was exploding with commentary about the incident. Some people were defending the store employees and police, claiming they had acted reasonably given the circumstances. Others were calling it a clear example of racial profiling and demanding accountability. One comment thread particularly caught her attention. A teacher in Chicago had shared the story with her students, using it as a starting point for a discussion about assumptions and prejudice. High school students were debating whether the store employees had acted appropriately, whether Kyla should have revealed her identity sooner, and what they would have done in similar circumstances. Reading their thoughtful responses reminded Kyla why she had chosen this career in the first place. She wanted to serve her country, to protect people who would never know her name or thank her for her service, but she also wanted to prove that intelligence and capability came in all forms, that young black women could excel in fields where they were rarely seen or expected. Her phone rang again, this time with a call from her mother. Word had apparently reached her family about the incident, probably through the same social media channels that were spreading the story everywhere else. "Baby girl, are you okay?" Her mother's voice was full of concern and pride in equal measure. "I saw the video online. I cannot believe how professional you stayed throughout that whole mess." "I am fine, Mom. Just dealing with the aftermath. Your father and I are so proud of you. Not just for how you handled yourself today, but for everything you have accomplished. You know that, right?" Kyla felt tears forming in her eyes. The stress of the day, combined with her mother's unconditional support, broke through the professional composure she had maintained since leaving the store. "It was so frustrating, Mom. I was just trying to do my job and they treated me like I was some kind of criminal, all because of what I looked like." "I know, honey. I know. But you showed them who you really are. You showed everyone watching that they cannot judge a book by its cover." As the sun began to set over the pond, Kyla made her decision about the media interviews. She would speak publicly about what had happened, not for revenge or attention, but because young people needed to see that their dreams were possible regardless of what others might think about their potential. 3 days later, she sat across from a national news anchor, wearing a professional suit but speaking with the same calm authority she had displayed in the electronics store. The interview was watched by millions of people, sparking conversations in schools, workplaces, and homes across the country. "What do you want people to take away from your experience?" the anchor asked. Kyla looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the young people who might be watching, all the kids who had been told they did not look like leaders or professionals or federal agents. "I want people to understand that service to your country comes in many forms, and it is performed by Americans who look like me, and Americans who look completely different from me. Intelligence, dedication, and patriotism are not limited by age, race, or gender. When we make assumptions about people based on their appearance, we do not just hurt individuals, we hurt our entire society by wasting human potential." The interview sparked a nationwide conversation about bias, assumptions, and the hidden diversity of America's intelligence services. Tech World Electronics issued a public apology and announced new training programs for their staff. The local police department began reviewing their procedures for responding to suspicious person calls. But for Kyla, the most meaningful response came from a letter she received a few weeks later. It was from a 15-year-old girl in Detroit who had seen the interview and decided to pursue a career in intelligence analysis. "I never thought someone like me could do work like that," the girl wrote. "Thank you for showing me that it is possible." Sitting in her new office at CIA headquarters, where she now worked as a senior analyst and occasional public speaker, Kyla smiled as she read the letter. Her undercover career might be over, but her service to her country had taken on a new dimension. She was no longer just protecting national security in secret. She was inspiring the next generation of Americans who would carry on that mission. Sometimes, the most important victories happen not in the shadows, but in the bright light of truth where everyone could see them. Sometimes the best way to serve your country was to stand up and be counted, to show the world that heroes came in all colors, all ages, and all backgrounds. The electronics store incident had ended her career as an undercover agent, but it had begun something even more important. A conversation about who Americans really were, and who they could become when given the chance to prove themselves.